What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to bring you the wide receiver review for 2021. As you guys will recall, I did on Wednesday the running back review where I basically talked about the league winners at the running back position. I talked about the top 24 running backs in PPR, half PPR points per game, some of the takeaways that I had from the season in general. And then I also reviewed some of my own calls and some of the predictions that I made back in June and July when I talked about the what makes a league winner at each position series. Well, today, again, I'm doing the same thing for the wide receiver position. Like I said, if you recall back in June or July, I did a 4-part series basically outlining the anatomy of a league winner at each position for running backs, for quarterbacks, wide receivers, tight ends. And at each position from 2020 to 2014, I looked at the volume-based factors and the situational-based factors that it took for a lot of these guys to become league winners. So I looked at, again, their volume-based factors, carries, targets, receptions, touchdowns, etc. And then I looked at the situational factors, how many games their team won, points for, offensive line play, quarterback play, highest targeted secondary option on their offense type of thing. So that's what I'm going to be getting into in today's video. Again, we're basically going to start by looking at the league winners at wide receiver this year, talking about the top 24 wide receivers in PPR points per game, some of the takeaways that we had from the season, and then review some of the calls that I had in the offseason. So if you enjoy this video, as always, hit the like button, comment any of your thoughts down below, and subscribe to the channel if you are new. We're going to hit the intro, and then we're going to get right into this. Okay, so at wide receiver, I defined a league winner as a wide receiver who averaged 20 PPR points per game with a minimum of 12 games played. And again, I did that because I didn't want to leave anybody out who only played 13, 14 games, but in those 13, 14 games was dominant. So anybody who didn't play 16 games, I always use points per game. You guys know that around here. And I use PPR for a specific reason as well, because it balances the touchdown scoring wide receivers with the target hog wide receivers pretty well. So that's why I use that format. And again, this is what it spit out. The volume-based factors for all of the wide receivers from 2014 to 2020 that finished with 20 plus PPR points per game. And again, you guys can see some special wide receiver seasons on here. Of course, we have Michael Thomas's record-breaking 2019. We have Antonio Brown and his dominance. We have Julio Jones and Calvin Johnson, Brandon Marshall, all these guys that had special wide receiver seasons. Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill in the last couple of years. And of course, I outlined how much volume that they actually required to get to that point, because some guys did it on less target volume, less receptions. Maybe they had more touchdowns, whatever the case might be. And another contributing factor that I wanted to look for was the situational based factors, right? How good were these teams' offenses ranked in points per game? Were they on a bottom 10 NFL offense, or for the most part, were they in really good offenses? Their quarterback, how good was their quarterback play? How many times was their team throwing the ball? Obviously, because that matters, because if you have a 25% target share in a 650 pass attempt offense versus a 25% target share in the 49ers passing offense, which only throws the ball 480 times a season, that's a vastly different outcome in terms of the amount of targets that you can get. Of course, I always talked about their secondary option too, because if you do have, a really good secondary wide receiver, tight end, running back, whatever the case is, involved in the passing game, it's pretty hard for you to achieve that 170, 180 target potential like we saw from a guy like Cooper Kupp this year. Offensive line rank and pass blocking, I also wanted to see if that played a factor. And then ranking yards per route run was just a way for me to test how talented of a wide receiver they were, because highly talented wide receivers usually rank highly in yards per route run, as was the case this year. The top 3 fantasy wide receivers, Devontae Adams, Deebo Samuel, and Cooper Kupp, were also the top 3 wide receivers in yards per route run. And in the running backs video on Wednesday, we just had Jonathan Taylor meet these elite thresholds, right? For the elite league-winning running back, it was 20 half PPR points per game, and only Jonathan Taylor met that expectation. But this year, we actually had 3 wide receivers meet it. And as you guys can see them on the screen, Devontae Adams, Cooper Kupp, and Deebo Samuel, they were elite fantasy wide receivers this year. All 3 of them averaged 20 or more PPR points per game, with Cooper Kupp obviously having a phenomenal season, 25.8 PPR points per game. And you guys can see that they kind of did it in different ways. Cooper Kupp did it through obscene volume, right? 11.5 targets per game, 8.63 receptions per game. And the colors in green mean that they were well above the averages on the right side of the screen of those elite players that I talked about from 2020 to 2013. Those guys that had the elite targets, the elite receptions, elite touchdowns, and had those elite league-winning wide receiver seasons. Cooper Kupp was even above them in terms of his overall targets. Devontae Adams much more in line. from a volume perspective. And then Deebo Samuel, completely rare case, right? Because Deebo Samuel, 7.67 targets per game is the single lowest amount of targets that anybody has achieved a 20 plus PPR scoring season. But the reason it worked for Deebo Samuel is because he's heavily involved on the ground, right? This is a guy that was averaging 3 to 4 carries per game at minimum. And there was, of course, a couple games where he had 8, 9, 10 carries. So this is a guy that was involved heavily on the ground. And again, this is also a situation that is very specific to Deebo Samuel because he has Kyle Shanahan, a very creative offensive coordinator that knows how to use him. So Deebo Samuel, again, I highly doubt there is somebody that is going to achieve this elite threshold with only 7.67 targets per game like Deebo Samuel did. And if you do achieve that, you're usually going to need some kind of gadget role like what Deebo Samuel has. But again, as you can see in their situational factors, they did kind of align. All three of these teams were top, 12, top 13 scoring offenses. They all had quarterbacks that were playing pretty well. Even Jimmy Garoppolo in Deebo Samuel's case ranked top 12 in quarterback rating. Team pass attempts, again, like I said, Cooper Kupp and Davante Adams followed the much more traditional path of being, 550 pass attempts or more. Deebo Samuel on only 481 pass attempts was able to do this, which is very, very impressive. And like I said, part of that was because he was heavily involved in the running game. If he was strictly a wide receiver, he definitely would not have achieved the ceiling that he achieved. Probably would have been more of the 15 to 17 PPR points per game, which is still a great fantasy wide receiver, but it's not that elite league winning ceiling that we saw out of Deebo Samuel this year. And then highest targeted secondary option. I also wanted to test how, involved was the secondary piece on their offense. Now, in Cooper Kupp's case, I actually combined Robert Woods and Odell Beckham Jr.'s targets into one player just because their timelines kind of interacted the exact same. As soon as Robert Woods got injured is when Odell Beckham Jr. stepped in. So they didn't really miss a beat from the secondary option in that offense. So I just combined their two target shares to equal the 112 targets that they each saw combined. And then Davante Adams, obviously, he's the clear number one in his offense. And same went for Deebo Samuel, only 87 targets to George Kittle, who was the second highest targeted option in that San Francisco 49ers passing game. And then obviously they all had good offensive lines. They all ranked highly in yards per route run, like I said. So those were the league winning wide receivers this year. Those were the guys that if you drafted them, obviously you probably made your playoffs, probably your championships as well. And a number of you guys probably won your championships. I myself had Davante Adams, and I won my championship in large part because of Davante Adams. And I'm sure many of you guys that had Deebo Samuel, I had him in a listener dynasty league where my running back core wasn't very good. But Deebo Samuel, Davante Adams, I actually had both of those guys, were able to carry me to the championship where I eventually lost, but still was able to get a 7-7 team to the championship with terrible running back play because those wide receivers were just that dominant. So here were the overall wide receiver standings. Now, again, we're just going to look at these, kind of make some takeaways, talk about the primary reason why these guys were here. And as you guys can see them on the screen, this is a little different than it was for running backs because at running back, there was a lot of avenues where you can achieve a league winning ceiling or just a running back one season in general, where you can become, a touchdown scorer, a big play threat, very efficient. You can, get a lot of volume. You can get a lot of receiving work. Like there's a lot of different avenues for running backs to get there and become RB1 type players. For wide receivers, it is a little bit different because you're not really running the ball unless you're Deebo Samuel. So you can really only get there one of like three ways, which is being efficient on your targets. Let's say you have like 105 target season, but you average 18 yards per reception, similar to somebody along the framework of like Tyreek Hill early in his career and what Marquise Brown was doing earlier in the season and some guys like that. And then obviously you can be a heavily targeted wide receiver like a Deontay Johnson, for example, who you're getting, 160 targets on the season. You have multiple double-digit target games, and that's how you get your fantasy appeal. There was a lot of receivers like that, like Cooper Kupp, Davante Adams, Deontay Johnson, like I said. And then obviously you could score a lot of touchdowns too, which is what Mike Evans did. It's what we saw DK Metcalf do, although he didn't finish as a wide receiver one this season. If you score a lot of touchdowns, again, you're probably going to have a good chance of finishing highly. But similar to running backs, you don't need to be perfect to finish as a wide receiver one. Of course, you probably need to be closer to perfect to finish as one of those league winning wide receivers like Cooper Kupp and like Davante Adams and Deebo Samuel, but you don't need 180 targets plus 8 50-yard bombs every season and 8 receptions per game and an elite quarterback and no other targets worth a damn in your offense and an offense that throws the ball 45 times a game. You don't need all those factors to be an elite league-winning wide receiver, nor do you need them, especially for just being a wide receiver one in general. And like I said, for running backs, it's all about defining a path. So the reason we're doing this exercise, basically, and I didn't even really mention this at the beginning of the video, but we're doing this so that we can refine our process going into next year. This is reflective-based content that we're doing right now because we want to learn from the guys that did it this year. We want to know, okay, the wide receiver ones this year, what made them wide receiver ones? If you can define a clear path, and I'll use my own team for an example, because I was very heavily invested in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver core because I believed in their outlook. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers had the too many mouths to feed narrative, right? A lot of people, fantasy analysts, I'm sure that you heard, talked about the fact that they didn't like investing in a guy like Mike Evans or Chris Godwin because of all the weapons that they had in Tampa Bay, which caused a lot of people to avoid Mike Evans and Chris Godwin to their detriment because both of them finished as wide receiver ones in points per game. But again, if you outlined their path to wide receiver one production, then you would have been targeting these guys because it made sense, right? For Mike Evans, his path to wide receiver one production was scoring a lot of touchdowns. Now, that's not usually something you want to rely on, but when you're, a 6'5", 240-pound wide receiver that is heavily involved in the red zone and has an elite quarterback, then it's pretty easy to rely on Mike Evans to score a lot of touchdowns, especially in an offense that ranks second overall in points per game overall on the entire season. And then for Chris Godwin in that same offense, he had a different path to being a wide receiver one. His was target volume. He needed to be a guy that got, 8, 9, 10 targets per game. And the reason that Tom Brady could support both of these guys and Antonio Brown, who also finished very highly in points per game on the limited amount of games that he played, is because the offense threw nearly 700 times and he has an MVP candidate quarterback. So that is basically why you need to outline the path, because traditionally you look at an offense with three great wide receivers like Antonio Brown and a tight end like Rob Gronkowski, and you're like, it's not possible. These guys can't all produce for fantasy. But when you know that the offense is going to throw the ball like crazy and be very efficient, then it makes it easier to be able to invest in a situation like that. And again, you could look at the opposite side of the coin and look at the Denver Broncos, for an example. An offense that wasn't going to throw the ball a whole lot, that didn't have an elite quarterback. And then you can apply that too many mouths to feed argument to that team because Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton, Noah Fant, the running game, KJ Hamler when he was healthy, all these guys can contribute, but not all of them can be elite fantasy options because we don't have an offense that throws enough and we don't have a good enough quarterback. So back to the overall wide receiver ones. And again, you guys should still be able to see them on the screen. It's interesting to me that none of these guys were late round guys, right? The lowest drafted player in the wide receiver one range this year in points per game was Deebo Samuel. And Deebo Samuel went just inside the top 100 picks, about 95th overall, a guy that you could consistently get in the 6th, 7th round. So he was actually the lowest drafted player among all these guys. 11 of these 12 guys came in those first 4 rounds or so where we preached to hammer wide receivers, right? Me and Danny talked about it all offseason, where you don't want to force a running back pick in rounds 3, rounds 4, rounds 5, whatever round that you're in those mid rounds, especially because typically those running backs come with a lot of question marks, a lot of baggage, and a lot of concerns. Whereas the wide receivers in that range, let's say, for example, you're debating Josh Jacobs versus Cooper Kupp or versus Chris Godwin or versus T. Higgins or Jamar Chase or whoever you were debating them between. I saw and Danny saw, we both saw these outlooks for these wide receivers that was far safer than a guy like Josh Jacobs or James Robinson or Darrell Henderson or Myles Gaskin, whatever mid-round running back that you guys were looking at. So that definitely came to fruition in the end of season wide receiver finishes, because a lot of those guys came in rounds 3, rounds 4, rounds 5, as well as the first 2 rounds where all the elite guys like Keenan Allen and Justin Jefferson and, DK Metcalf and AJ Brown and Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, all those guys were going in that range. But a lot of those guys came from rounds 3 to 5 as well. And then looking at the wide receiver 2s, these were the guys that finished obviously between 13 and 24 on the season in PPR points per game. It was a little bit more of a diverse outlook for these guys, right? We didn't see only early round guys go here, obviously. Hunter Renfrow, Brandon Cooks, Hollywood Brown, Mike Williams, and Jalen Waddle. So 5 of the 12 guys that finished as wide receiver 2s. Those guys all went outside the top 100 picks in rounds like 7 to 10 of your drafts. I'd imagine most of those guys went in that range. And then the rest of those guys came from the wide receiver sweet spot that I talked about already in that rounds 1 to 4 range or so. So looking at the wide receiver 1s and 2s, again, you got a sample size of about 17 of those guys or 18 of those guys came from those early rounds where we're looking to hammer wide receivers, right? If we see a running back on the board and we don't like his outlook, we think he has way too many question marks, we should be taking wide receivers. We should be taking a different position, maybe quarterback, tight end, because running backs are consistently overvalued in fantasy, and the wide receiver position can pay big dividends if you just draft the best player overall, which is really all it comes down to, right? We could talk about, hero RB, zero RB, robust RB, whatever the case is. If you just look at objectively, take the position away, who has the best outlook regardless of position, you'll generally become a better fantasy player and a better drafter. So now I'm going to look back at the predictions that I made back in June, July. Again, like I said, I did a video titled "Who is the next league winning wide receiver?" And I broke down all these factors and I tried to establish a ceiling and a floor for certain players. And again, when you change your mindset, and I talked about this on the running back video, to map out what ceiling actually means for a player, you'll become a much better fantasy player, because it's very easy for me to say coming into the season that, Allen Robinson had top 5 ceiling, for example. If I could have just said that, nobody would have contested me on it, because it's very easy for me or another analyst to just use the word top 5 ceiling and people just accept it and visualize it in their head. But when you can contextualize what ceiling actually means, meaning how much volume it takes to get there, what your situation needs to be to get there, then it outlines a path of how a player needs to get there, right? For Allen Robinson, the only way he would have achieved a top 5 ceiling this year is if he saw 170, 180 targets. And he definitely didn't see that, right? So the fact that I knew his situational factors weren't going to be great with a rookie quarterback, a bad coaching staff, all that stuff that we know about the Chicago Bears, then we needed that outlined, ceiling of volume for Allen Robinson, just as an example. So outlining their path and outlining a player's path to achieving their ceiling is how you can spot these breakout candidates. It's also how you can spot busts and bad draft picks as well, which ultimately leads you to win fantasy leagues, because there's two sides of the coin, right? You also want to avoid busts at the same time that you're trying to spot breakouts. So a couple takeaways from the predictions that I did. And again, what I tried to do was measure the ceiling outcome for these players, right? So if I have a yes beside their name in terms of targets, it meant, could I feasibly or possibly see them having a 150, 160 target season? If I couldn't see it, then I would write the word no. If I didn't know, like for example, with Jamar Chase, he's a rookie. I had no idea what his target potential was going to be. So I just put a question mark, which obviously was weighted less than no in the video that I did. And same goes for if they could have like a double-digit touchdown season, I would put yes, no, whatever. And if I've seen them do it already, or if I had very high confidence that they could achieve well over that target or touchdown potential, then I would put a green yes beside their name. So looking at this list, the first 3 were pretty accurate. I think Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams were pretty easy to evaluate. I definitely did not see Kyler Murray spreading the ball out as much as he did, though. That was a big miss for me on DeAndre Hopkins. And I think a lot of people assumed that DeAndre Hopkins was a very safe pick, a guy that you could, draft in the mid-second round, late second round, and he would be a stud anchor wide receiver 1 for you. But the Cardinals really spread the ball out a lot more than we thought they were going to. We thought that DeAndre Hopkins was going to be 150, 160, 170 target guy again. And we didn't think really anybody else in that offense was going to get more than 50 to 100 targets maximum. And that's not really what happened. All those guys contributed to some degree. Calvin Ridley, obviously, when he left, he was basically a prime buy low candidate based on the usage and the targets that he was seeing. So I think he would have been really good if he would have stayed on the field. Obviously, he left football for different reasons. I think I may have gone a little bit too conservative on Justin Jefferson's target potential. I don't know why I put question marks beside if he could achieve 150, 160 target ceiling, because I think it was pretty obvious that he could have done that. So I think I definitely went a little bit too conservative there. I also was too low on the target potential of 3 guys, mainly Cooper Kupp, Chris Godwin, and Deontay Johnson. Obviously, Deontay Johnson, I put no's all the way down the board, when in reality, he had been a guy that was consistently getting double-digit targets 2 years ago. So I should have looked at that and known that Deontay Johnson did have the target ceiling. And same goes for a guy like Cooper Kupp. In his prime with Jared Goff in 2018, he was a guy that was heavily targeted. So he did always have that high target potential. And we obviously saw that come to fruition. Now, the situational factors are a little bit more interesting. So I'll talk about these a little bit more than I did with the volume. But the 2 old missed wide receivers, DK Metcalf and AJ Brown, they definitely disappointed relative to where you drafted them, because you probably drafted them in the mid to early second round, maybe the late second round at worst. But their talent did shine through in when they needed it. So that part I was accurate about, but I didn't really take into too much account that their situations were a little bit less ideal than I was leading on. I thought the Seahawks offense and the Titans offense were both going to be among the top 10 to 12 offenses in the league. And they had their moments, but they definitely struggled to some degree as well. Keenan Allen, pretty much the outlook I had of him was a guy that was just a great value all around last year. Very few holes that you could poke in his game. He was a guy that was highly targeted, was going to be involved in the red zone to scoring touchdown potential. Obviously, he had a very good quarterback. He had a very good offense. He didn't have a whole lot of target competition outside of Austin Eckler. And obviously, Mike Williams did kind of emerge more than I thought this year. But yeah, everything that we saw with Keenan Allen, team pass attempts, ranking yards per route run, everything kind of lined up for Keenan Allen being a great value this year. And I'm glad I heavily invested in him. The Cowboys offense overall with CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper specifically was definitely disappointing from a passing standpoint. Now, it's really hard for me to say that because they weren't bad. Obviously, they finished number 1 in points for in the NFL. So they scored the most points in the league and they ranked number 4 in pass attempts overall. But due to how they spread the ball around, they used Dalton Schultz more than we thought. They used Michael Gallup quite a bit. Even some of the other guys that they had involved in the game plan, plus the inconsistency that we saw from Dallas. They had that down stretch in the middle of the season where they just weren't performing. that kind of resulted in Cooper and Lamb not hitting the ceilings that we expected for them. I expected, Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb to both be wide receiver ones coming into the season. They definitely had that potential. They had the potential to potentially both be top 5 wide receivers, similar to what we saw from the Buccaneers wide receivers back in 2019. And they definitely didn't reach that ceiling. Both of them finished outside the top 12 wide receivers. They both fit into the, I believe CeeDee Lamb was the wide receiver 15. Amari Cooper was the wide receiver 26. So they weren't necessarily what we expected out of them. And that definitely was an oversight on our part. The Bucs were the opposite side of the coin, though, right? Their offense was extremely concentrated. They used Evans, Godwin, Antonio Brown when he was on the field, and Rob Gronkowski when he was on the field as the only weapons in that offense. They didn't use any tertiary pieces. Leonard Fournette was really the only other guy that got targets outside of those main weapons, and they all hit their ceilings, right? Top 12 wide receivers, all of them, Antonio Brown, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin in points per game. Obviously, Antonio Brown didn't play too many games, so he wasn't in the wide receiver ones overall, but he did finish as a wide receiver one in terms of his points per game output when he was actually on the field and healthy. And then Terry McLaurin was a guy that I was really high on coming into the season. He was kind of just a victim of circumstance, to be honest, though. I was really excited for Ryan Fitzpatrick this year. I thought he was going to be the best quarterback, bar none, that Terry McLaurin had ever had. And if you told me Taylor Heineke was going to be his quarterback the entire season, I definitely wouldn't have invested as heavily in Terry McLaurin as I did. But losing Ryan Fitzpatrick to me was a bigger loss than people, I think, will tend to lead on, because I think Ryan Fitzpatrick was a significant upgrade over Taylor Heineke. Now, again, you might disagree with that, but I do think Ryan Fitzpatrick was set to have, a top 12, top 15 quarterback type of season for the Washington football team. Allen Robinson's writing, I already kind of talked about it, was on the wall. I'm glad I stayed far away from Allen Robinson in drafts. He was one of my biggest bust candidates coming into the season, because the situational factors to me just were so bad that this guy was going to need 160, 170, 180 targets to be very good this year. And as I talked about in the offseason, I did think that Cole Kmet and Darnell Mooney would be more involved than they were in years past, because in years past, we had seen Allen Robinson dominate his target share, similar to the tune of what Devontae Adams does in Green Bay. And I just didn't think that was going to happen again in Chicago with some of the weapons that they added and some of the guys they drafted last year coming into form and coming into their second seasons. And again, just looking at this in general, I think the biggest takeaway that I can make is looking at the ceiling of the offense to help guide the ceiling of the player, right? Because looking at the situational factors here, I think you can kind of recognize the fact that the best offenses produced the best fantasy options, right? It's pretty simple and it's pretty straightforward, but every year we talk ourselves into good players and bad offenses. But Cooper Kupp's ceiling was evident by the fact that I really like the Rams' chances to be the best team in the NFC this year. I really like the Rams' chances to have a MVP caliber quarterback in Matthew Stafford, which obviously benefits everybody involved, which is why I drafted a lot of Cooper Kupp and in turn drafted some Robert Woods as well. So that's basically what my thoughts were behind this entire exercise. Is like, when you're doing the situational factors, it is always better to invest in players that you can see a very, very high ceiling for their offense and for their quarterback play as a whole, because at wide receiver, they're directly correlated, obviously. So that is it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. A lot of macro game theory in this one. This was meant to be reflective on the season, right? The reason I'm looking at all this stuff is so that I can refine my process better for next season. So that breakout candidate that I missed, the Deebo Samuel, for example, because I missed on Deebo Samuel this year, I can better refine my approach to potentially spot that breakout candidate this time next year or in the future. That's why I do these reflective things. It's not necessarily because I think you guys will benefit a whole lot from it. It's honestly because I benefit a whole lot from it, because I can give you guys better advice by the fact that I'm looking at my own predictions, what I did right, what I did wrong, and also looking at what the brass tacks of who finished highly, who was the league winners, etc. So if you did enjoy this video, comment down below any of your thoughts. We are into the off season now, so if you have any suggestions for videos, go ahead and leave them in the comments down below. You'd be surprised. We've definitely made a lot of videos that have been suggested by our viewers. So if you don't think we'll listen to you, that is not the case. So if you have a great idea for a video, please leave it in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new as well. If you want to become a member of the channel, you can go to Fantasy Stock Exchange on YouTube and hit the join button. You'll get priority response to comments, emojis, badges, etc. We'll also be running some members only live streams and polls into the off season once we have a lot of members going. So if you guys want to support us, you can do that for about $3.50 American per month. It's not a lot of money, $5 a month Canadian. So peace out, guys, and I'll talk to you soon.